Less than a week after Hurricane Katrina struck the city of New Orleans on Sunday morning, September 4th, 2005, an NBC News camera crew was on a bridge over the Industrial Canal when they heard a commotion on the next bridge over. Here's what NBC's cameras caught that day. Police officers in a rental truck, not marked as a police vehicle, firing their weapons at something. Impossible to tell what from that news crew's vantage point. And within hours, New Orleans police were giving their version of events. They said police had confronted a gang of armed men, that the men had shot at the police first, and the police had returned fire. A very different story emerged later. The people on the Danziger Bridge that day were unarmed. They were crossing the bridge apparently to try to find food and a safe place to stay as their city drowned. But a police call came in saying that officers are being shot at on that bridge. They weren't, but 7 officers responded to that call, and when the smoke cleared, 2 civilians were dead and 4 were wounded. None of the victims were armed. Yesterday, one of the 7 officers there at the bridge pled guilty to helping cover up those shootings. He is the 3rd officer in the past month and a half to plead guilty to covering up what happened with those shootings that day on the bridge. A cover-up that involved a planted gun, phony witnesses, falsified police reports, and lying to a state grand jury that convened to investigate the case. In the course of entering his guilty plea, prosecutors revealed that Officer Michael Hunter's chilling account of what happened after the police began firing. According to the account, quote, defendant Hunter saw several civilians who appeared to be unarmed, injured, and subdued. Sergeant A suddenly leaned over the concrete barrier, held out his assault rifle, and in a sweeping motion, fired repeatedly at the civilians lying wounded on the ground. The indictment also describes what happened when Officer Hunter and Sergeant A drove to the other side of the bridge in pursuit of 3 men who were running away from the scene. One of the men was a severely mentally disabled man named Ronald Madison. Officer Hunter's account continues as follows. Officer A, without warning, fired a shotgun at Ronald Madison's back as Madison ran away. As Ronald Madison lay dying on the pavement, Sergeant A ran down the bridge toward Ronald and asked an officer if Ronald was one of them. When the officer replied in the affirmative, Sergeant A began kicking or stomping Ronald Madison repeatedly with his foot. Ronald Madison was 40 years old. He later died, as did 19-year-old James Brissett. 4 other people, all unarmed, were wounded on the bridge that day. Murder charges were brought in this case initially. They were dropped in 2008. There is now some speculation that those charges, murder charges, may resurface. Travers Mackle has been covering the story of the Danziger Bridge shooting since 2005. He's an investigative reporter with NBC's New Orleans affiliate WDSU. He's also a New Orleans native. Mr. Mackle, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
What's the broad context of what was happening on the bridge that day? How many people were on the bridge that day? What do we know about what they were doing?
Well, it seems right now that they were just trying to get out of New Orleans. We all know that New Orleans was underwater. You know, conditions were not good. Times were dire. This is when communication was completely cut off. This is just a couple of days after the storm. It's believed now that these people were just looking for a dry place, a safe place to go, possibly airlift or a ride out of the city of New Orleans. It was painted in a different light in these police reports. In the police reports, officers initially said that the people on the bridge were armed and were firing at them. Now, defense attorneys for the police officers involved in this still stand by that story. They stand by the fact that these officers had to retaliate because they were fired at first. But as you just pointed out, several officers have now flipped and are working with the government, saying that they falsified their report and that a lot of what happened on that bridge was made up to protect these officers who are, in their own words, out of line.
Well, what was the source of the reported police call that officers were being shot at on that bridge? Has that ever been cleared up, and has it ever been proven that officers were ever shot at?
You know, it's unknown at this point. Obviously, defense attorneys for the officers, they were known as the Danziger 7 because these 7 officers responded to the call on the bridge. Michael Hunter has since pleaded guilty. The other 6 officers remain and maintain that they are innocent and did nothing wrong. But as for the police call, there's still a lot of questions on how this call came in. It came in as officers in jeopardy, shots fired. So the officers, I know you've been showing the video, jumped into that rented truck. You know, remember, police cars were flooded. Officers didn't have a lot lot of easy ways to get around the city of New Orleans. They were commandeering anything they could get that was still drivable. They jumped in that moving van and headed out to the Danziger Bridge, and from that video started shooting. They say they were fired at first, but like I said, police reports say they were fired at first, but now the court documents that have recently been revealed prove a different story and tell a different story, as these officers are now starting to plead guilty and work with the government and admitting that they falsified the police reports and that these civilians were in fact unarmed.
And Travers, it's not just that the story is changing, it is that we are learning about this cover-up, and it was an elaborate cover-up. I mean, for planning evidence, falsified reports, fake witnesses being invented. With so much effort put into this cover-up effort, why did it fall apart? How did it start to fall apart?
You know, the feds started looking at it, and I think they started squeezing a lot of people. They thought that the story didn't make sense from about 2 years following Katrina, and they really started asking some hard, difficult questions. A lot of things didn't add up. And, you know, we should point out, Rachel, that 2 other officers, Mike Lohman and Jeff Learman, have pleaded guilty. They were not on the bridge. They pled guilty for conspiring after the fact, as you said, making up witnesses, planting a gun, having late-night meetings to get officers' stories straight so they could tell federal prosecutors and state prosecutors the same story and make it seem like everything was above board and make it seem like these officers were doing their job, protecting their lives with what these officers say was not the case. These 3 officers who have since pled guilty. So there are still a lot of questions, but the case started to fall apart when federal prosecutors really started digging into this.
Travers, briefly, one last question about this. I understand that one of the victims, the brother of the man who was killed, the 40-year-old man who was killed, a man named Lance Madison, was actually arrested by New Orleans police in connection with this shooting. What happened in his case?
Those charges have been dropped. He was initially arrested at the scene for attempted murder of police officers, and in fact, that turned out not to be true. Those charges were later dropped. It turns out that his brother was the mentally handicapped man who unfortunately was killed that day on the bridge, and it seemed like they were just trying to get help and get out of the city of New Orleans, but those charges against Mr. Madison have since been dropped. And, you know, we should point out, you know, you touched on the fact that how is the city of New Orleans handling this? You know, I think a lot of people are shocked and distraught in the city of New Orleans. They can't believe that this is going on. And, you know, New Orleans is a city that sometimes has some distrust in its police department, and this only lends itself to that. They have about 1,500 police officers, the bulk of them good law-abiding cops, and it's unfortunate when things like this go down. You know, it gives a black eye, most people in the city of New Orleans feel, to the entire police department.
Travers Mackel, investigative reporter with NBC's New Orleans affiliate WDSU. Travers, thank you very much for your reporting on this. Appreciate your time.